You're watching this video right now because something catastrophic is happening in Russia that the mainstream media isn't fully connecting the dots on. And I'm not talking about just another headline or another sanction announcement. I'm talking about a perfect storm that's converging right now in January 2026, a storm that could fundamentally reshape the global order as we know it. Because here's what they're not telling you. Vladimir Putin's Russia isn't just struggling anymore. The entire foundation that's kept his regime afloat for over 2 decades is cracking, and the cracks are becoming chasms. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand why 2026 might be the year that everything changes. Let's start with the numbers that should terrify anyone in the Kremlin right now. As of January 11th, 2026, Russia has suffered approximately 1,218,940 casualties in Ukraine. Think about that for a second. 1.2 million. That's not a typo. That's more casualties than the Soviet Union suffered during the entire 1,418 days of fighting Nazi Germany in World War II. Except Putin's war has now lasted 1,419 days and counting, and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte revealed something even more chilling. 25,000 Russian soldiers are being killed every single month. That's not wounded, that's killed. 833 deaths every single day. More than 34 Russian soldiers dying every hour. But here's the catch. Putin keeps sending more men into the meat grinder, and he's running out of both men and machines. According to Globsec analysis published just hours ago, Russia has reached an estimated 1,200,000 casualties and is depleting Soviet-era equipment reserves that analysts thought would last years. The T-62 tanks from the 1960s are being pulled out of storage facilities that haven't been opened since the Cold War ended. Russia is literally fighting a modern war with museum pieces, and the reason is simple. They can't replace what they're losing fast enough. The Washington Post reported in late December 2025 that Russia's economy is now in its worst state since the full-scale invasion began, and the word they used wasn't struggling or challenged. They said it could break in 2026. Now let's talk about the economic time bomb that's ticking underneath Putin's war machine. Russia's GDP growth is projected to slow to just 1% in 2026, down from the war-spending-fueled boom of 7% annually that Putin enjoyed during his first presidential term in the early 2000s. The Central Bank of Russia has interest rates at nearly 20%, which is economic code for we're desperately trying to stop inflation from destroying everything. Think about what a 20% interest rate means for ordinary Russians. It means mortgages are impossible. Business loans are suicidal. Credit cards become debt traps that consume entire paychecks. The ruble, which was trading at around 75 to the dollar before the war, has been in free fall, and analysts predict devaluation to between 100 and 120 rubles per dollar in 2026. But here's where it gets really interesting, and this is the part that mainstream coverage glosses over. Russia's entire economic model for the last quarter century has been built on one thing: energy exports. Oil and gas revenues have been the money printer that allowed Putin to fund his military, pay government salaries, and maintain the massive security apparatus that keeps him in power. In 2026, that money printer is jamming. New U.S. sanctions announced in January specifically target Russia's oil infrastructure, hitting major Russian oil companies and the shadow fleet of tankers that have been circumventing previous sanctions. According to analysis published just 9 hours ago by The Guardian, Russia is already scrambling to find workarounds to ensure countries like India can continue importing cheap Russian crude oil. But the walls are closing in. Russia sharply reduced oil production in December 2025 because U.S. sanctions made it nearly impossible to find buyers for exports. When you can't sell your oil, you have to stop pumping it. And when you stop pumping oil, the revenue stream dries up. The Russian government's 2026 budget was based on oil prices and export volumes that are no longer realistic. They plan to raise an additional 5.5 trillion rubles, that's $70.7 billion, on the domestic market through bonds. But who's going to buy Russian government bonds when inflation is spiraling, the ruble is collapsing, and the country is burning through reserves fighting an unwinnable war? This brings us to what I call the resource death spiral. Putin has been funding the war by draining Russia's National Welfare Fund, which was supposed to be the rainy day fund for future generations. That fund has been hemorrhaging money, dropping from over $180 billion before the war to a fraction of that now. Russian economists quoted by Yahoo Finance in late December said the reserves could run dry in 2026. Not might run dry, could run dry. And when those reserves are gone, Putin faces an impossible choice: print money and trigger hyperinflation like Weimar Germany, or stop paying for the war machine and watch his military collapse. But wait, there's more. Let's talk about the human cost that's creating social pressure inside Russia that Putin can't ignore forever. Independent Russian media outlets Meduza and Mediazona, working with data leaks and analysis, estimated that as of August 2025, Russia had suffered 219,000 killed in action. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense puts Russian losses at over 33,000 just in December 2025 alone, calling these levels unsustainable. And they're right, because Russia's population demographics are terrible for sustaining a long war. The country has a declining birth rate, an aging population, and it's already mobilized hundreds of thousands of men who were the economic backbone of rural regions. Towns across Russia are emptying of working-age men. Factories are reporting labor shortages. The agricultural sector is struggling because the people who used to work the fields are either dead in Ukraine or hiding from conscription officers. Russian authorities have resorted to increasingly desperate measures to find more bodies for the front. They're recruiting from prisons, offering huge signing bonuses that the government can barely afford, and there are reports of forced conscription in ethnic minority regions where resistance to Moscow's rule has always simmered beneath the surface. This brings us to the internal fracture lines that nobody's talking about enough. Remember the Wagner mutiny in June 2023? Yevgeny Prigozhin, the warlord who commanded tens of thousands of mercenaries, launched an armed rebellion that briefly seized control of a major Russian city and marched his forces toward Moscow before mysteriously stopping. Prigozhin died in a suspicious plane crash 2 months later, and Putin has since dismantled Wagner and absorbed its remnants into the regular military structure. But here's what that rebellion revealed: the facade of unity in Russia is paper thin. Prigozhin's uprising exposed deep frustrations within the Russian military establishment about corruption, incompetence, and the way the war was being conducted. It showed that even powerful figures close to Putin could turn on him if they felt betrayed or saw the system as broken. And while the Kremlin crushed Wagner and eliminated Prigozhin, they didn't eliminate the underlying problems that caused the mutiny in the first place. Those problems have only gotten worse. In January 2024, Russian special forces were deployed to suppress protests in Bashkortostan, a republic in south-central Russia. These weren't anti-war protests in Moscow that could be dismissed as liberal dissidents. These were ethnic protests in a region where non-Russian populations have long resented Moscow's dominance. The Kremlin's response was brutal because they understand something crucial. If the ethnic republics start openly defying Moscow while the military is bogged down in Ukraine, the entire Russian Federation could begin to fracture. Russia isn't a homogeneous nation-state. It's a multi-ethnic empire held together by force and resource distribution from Moscow. When Moscow can't provide resources anymore because the money's gone, what happens to the empire? Now let's connect all these dots into the bigger picture. Putin's Russia is facing 5 simultaneous crises, each one feeding into the others in a vicious cycle. First, there's the military crisis. Russia is losing staggering numbers of troops and equipment with no end in sight and no realistic path to victory in Ukraine. Second, there's the economic crisis. Sanctions, falling oil revenues, depleted reserves, and unsustainable war spending are creating a financial implosion. Third, there's the demographic crisis. Russia is running out of young men to send to war, and the population loss will echo for generations. Fourth, there's the social crisis. Families are grieving, regions are emptying, and public discontent is being suppressed by increasingly violent means. Fifth, there's the political crisis. Putin has tied his legitimacy entirely to military success and national strength, but the war has delivered neither. These 5 crises are now converging in 2026, and the Kremlin knows it. You can see it in Putin's recent behavior. The New York Times reported just 3 days ago that Putin went uncharacteristically quiet when challenged by Trump over Venezuela, which analysts interpret as Putin desperately wanting to secure a favorable resolution in Ukraine before his negotiating position gets even weaker. Putin needs a win, any win that he can sell to the Russian people as justification for the catastrophic losses. But Ukraine, backed by Western weapons and aid, isn't collapsing. Kyiv is holding. The counteroffensive capabilities are improving. Time is not on Putin's side. The Institute for the Study of War published an assessment yesterday noting that Russia has failed in 4 of its 5 strategic objectives since retreating from Kyiv in April 2022. They failed at political subjugation of Ukraine. They failed at economic strangulation. They failed at breaking Western resolve. They failed at achieving decisive military victory. The only thing Putin has succeeded at is territorial occupation of parts of eastern and southern Ukraine, and even that territory is costing him everything to hold. This is why RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, published an analysis titled "Russia is Losing" in December 2025. They argue that Putin is now resorting to hybrid escalation, ramping up sabotage operations against European infrastructure, cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and threats, because conventional military victory is slipping beyond reach. Hybrid warfare is what you do when you can't win the actual war. It's the strategy of desperation. So, what does all this mean? It means we're entering what could be the most dangerous phase of this conflict. Wounded authoritarian regimes don't usually go quietly. They lash out, they escalate, they take risks that rational actors wouldn't take. We've already seen Russia deploy the Oreshnik intermediate-range ballistic missile in recent strikes, a nuclear-capable weapon being used to send a message. The Trump administration condemned this as dangerous escalation just 10 hours ago at a UN Security Council meeting. Putin is signaling that he's willing to raise the stakes, even as his economy crumbles and his military bleeds. But here's the other side of that coin. Regimes that are bleeding out economically and militarily often collapse faster than anyone expects. The Soviet Union in 1991 seemed stable until suddenly it wasn't. The entire edifice came down in months once the center couldn't hold. Putin's Russia isn't the Soviet Union, but it faces many of the same structural weaknesses: overextension, economic exhaustion, and an empire held together by force rather than genuine loyalty. The question isn't whether Russia is in crisis. The evidence is overwhelming that it is. The question is whether this crisis leads to regime change, a negotiated settlement that preserves Putin's power in some diminished form, or a dangerous escalation that drags the world into a broader conflict. All 3 scenarios are possible in 2026. What we're witnessing right now is a slow-motion collapse of the post-Soviet order that Putin spent decades building. The strongman image is cracking. The military that was supposed to be the second strongest in the world has been exposed as corrupt and incompetent. The economy that was supposed to be sanction-proof is buckling. The society that was supposed to be united behind Putin is fracturing along ethnic, regional, and class lines. Here's what you need to understand going forward. Every week that this war continues, Russia gets weaker. Every $1 billion drained from reserves is $1 billion that can't be used to rebuild. Every 1,000 soldiers killed is 1,000 families that will never forget what Putin cost them. Every percentage point of GDP lost is a percentage point that won't come back easily. The damage being done to Russia's long-term future is staggering, and it's all self-inflicted in pursuit of Putin's imperial ambitions. The Kremlin can control the domestic media narrative, they can arrest protesters, they can threaten dissidents, but they can't hide empty store shelves, they can't hide inflation, they can't hide the coffins coming home, and they can't hide the fact that 3 years into a war that was supposed to last 3 days, Ukraine is still standing and Russia is breaking. This is the story that's unfolding right now in real time. Major geopolitical shifts don't usually announce themselves with a bang. They happen gradually, then suddenly. We're in the gradually phase right now, watching Russia's economic indicators deteriorate, watching casualty numbers climb, watching the contradictions pile up. But history teaches us that gradually can become suddenly with shocking speed. So when you see headlines about Russia launching another missile strike or Putin giving another defiant speech, remember the context we've discussed here. Remember the 1.2 million casualties. Remember the 20% interest rates. Remember the depleted reserves. Remember the demographic crisis. Remember the 5 converging crises that are squeezing Putin's regime from every direction. The mainstream media will report individual events, individual data points, individual statements, but they often miss the bigger pattern. The pattern here is unmistakable. Russia is losing, and losing badly. and the consequences of that loss will reshape Europe and global geopolitics for decades to come. What happens next depends on variables we can't fully predict. How long can Putin maintain domestic control? Will the West maintain its resolve and support for Ukraine? Will China step in with economic lifelines that prolong Russia's agony? Will internal opposition grow bold enough to challenge Putin directly? Will there be more Wagner-style mutinies from within the security establishment? These are the questions that will define 2026. This is why you need to stay informed, stay critical, and pay attention to the signals beneath the noise, because something is breaking in Russia, and when it fully breaks, the world will change. Subscribe to this channel because we're going to be following this story closely as it develops. The next few months could be historic, and you're going to want to understand what's really happening, not just what the headlines say. Russia's crisis is no longer a matter of if, but when and how. The economic numbers don't lie. The casualty figures are undeniable. The trajectory is clear. Putin bet everything on a quick victory in Ukraine, and that bet has failed catastrophically. Now he's trapped in a war he can't win and can't afford to continue, but also can't afford to lose. That's the definition of a death spiral. Remember, knowledge is power, and understanding the deeper dynamics at play gives you the power to see the future taking shape before it arrives. Share this video with people who need to understand what's really happening. Leave a comment with your thoughts on where this is all heading. And most importantly, stay informed, stay critical, and keep watching this space, because in 2026, the world as we know it might be witnessing the beginning of the end of Putin's Russia, and that changes everything.